All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're unpacking a really specific and, for a lot of people, a pretty controversial theological argument about marriage, divorce, and remarriage. We're digging into the dissertation of an author named John D. Keller, and he lays out a case that he believes has some incredibly high stakes.
And let me tell you, he does not waste any time getting to the point. He kicks things off with this bombshell of a claim, basically saying that this isn't just a church debate, it's something with consequences for all of humanity. And you see that key phrase he zeroes in on? Those 5 words. He's basically arguing that this entire massive issue all hinges on what those 5 words actually mean. And we're going to get to exactly what they are in just a minute. So, to really get where he's coming from, we have to start where he starts. And that's not with divorce, but with the very nature of what he believes marriage is, right from the very beginning, at creation. This is the foundation for everything else he's going to build. He has this specific term he uses, creation marriage. Now, in his view, this isn't some social custom or a legal piece of paper that people came up with. No, he argues it's a fundamental, permanent law that God himself established, making the union of one man and one woman for life totally, completely unbreakable. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. He uses this powerful analogy to explain his point. He says that, you know how we don't argue with the law of gravity? It just is. Well, he believes we should see God's law of marriage the exact same way. In his mind, trying to break that union isn't just a bad idea, it's like trying to defy gravity. It's a fundamental, unchangeable law of the universe.
Okay, so once he has established that foundation, the story he tells is one of, well, constant attack. According to his historical take, this perfect, divine ideal of marriage has been under siege almost from day one, in what he sees as this long, sad history of corruption. He traces this decline through what he sees as key turning points in history. He points to the very first case of polygamy with Lamech, the sexual violence he attributes to Sodom, the common practice of incest in ancient Egypt, and then he brings it all the way to what he sees as the biggest threat of all, modern individualism.
And this quote he uses really gets to the heart of his concern about today. Citing the historian Will Durant, the author argues that our whole culture's focus on me is the final stage of this thousands of years long revolt against creation marriage. He even calls it the divorce war and the family war. And that brings us right back around to the absolute core of his whole dissertation, those 5 words from the very beginning. His entire case, everything he's arguing, really stands or falls on his unique interpretation of what this biblical exception clause for divorce is actually talking about.
Okay, so it all boils down to this one single Greek word, porneia. The author's whole argument is built on his claim that the way we usually translate this word is a huge mistake, and that it has a much more specific and much more narrow, legal meaning.
Now, look, this is probably the most controversial part of his entire argument, and it's fair to say that plenty of theologians would disagree with him here. But according to his research, porneia doesn't just mean any old sexual sin. He argues it refers to a very narrow, specific type of union, basically marriages that were illegal and forbidden from the get-go. The classic example he gives is an incestuous marriage, like when Herod Antipas married his own brother's wife. You have to understand, for his whole argument to work, this distinction is everything. He says that adultery was a sin you commit inside a real, valid marriage, and historically, that was a crime you could be put to death for, not divorced for. Porneia, on the other hand, describes a so-called marriage that was never a real marriage in the first place. So in his view, getting a divorce for porneia isn't ending a true marriage. It's just officially recognizing that an unlawful union was never valid.
So why? Why does this matter so much to him?
Well, because in his view, if you get the doctrine of marriage wrong, it sets off a domino effect that ends up corrupting one of the most important central ideas of his entire faith. Here's how he connects the dots. He argues that if you allow remarriage after a divorce for any reason other than his super specific definition of porneia, you're basically giving a thumbs up to what he calls holy adultery. He believes that living in that state makes it impossible to truly repent. And that, he says, leads people down a path of trying to earn their salvation through their own good works, which he sees as a direct attack on the doctrine of salvation by grace alone.
And that's what brings us to the big theological payoff here, sola gratia, or salvation by grace alone. This is the central theme of his entire work. For him, you can't separate the doctrine of marriage from the doctrine of grace. He writes that if you misinterpret marriage, you will inevitably end up contaminating the gospel of grace.
So he's laid out the history, the theology, and now he brings it all together in what he clearly intends as a very urgent warning for our time. He starts drawing these direct lines, these parallels between today and times in the past that he says came right before divine judgment. He looks at our society's constant talk about marriage and divorce and says it's just like the days of Noah. He compares modern sexual culture to Sodom. And maybe most importantly for him, he argues this collapse is even happening inside the church.
And just to really drive home how serious he thinks this all is, he pulls out this famous quote from Billy Graham. This is meant to underline his belief that the stakes could not be higher, and that the consequences of walking away from creation marriage are incredibly severe. And so we're left with this question, which really just wraps up his entire argument. By framing marriage not as a choice or a contract, but as an unbreakable law of nature like gravity, his interpretation really forces you to ask, what does he believe are the unavoidable consequences for people, for the church, and for all of society of trying to defy it?